On this episode of the Home Studio Hangout podcast, we have Spenser Liszt of Motif Planning and the Thriving Musicians podcast. Spenser was a previous touring musician turned financial planner.
For national, local acts, touring, recording, you name it, basically did everything under the sun.
And now his goal is to make sure that other musicians, producers, and mix engineers have really great financial plans for their life.
Financial literacy for DIY musicians, for people who can't afford or don't want to pay for what is really a high-level service.
So we made sure to ask the questions that you guys would want to know.
Like, is someone who is a full-time freelance producer, musician, what are the things that they should do, like day one?
So the first thing I would probably do is...
Welcome back to the Home Studio Hangout podcast. I am your host, Drew, here with my co-host, Josh. Josh, it's been a minute since you've been on an episode with me. Outside of the 100th episode, it's been a minute.
Yeah, it has been a minute.
Currently visiting family, so you're not in your home setup at all either. So
yeah,
I'm putting you through it right now.
I know.
But today we have a super interesting conversation and something that me and Josh have been wanting to talk about for a while. And that's the finance side of the music and production world. And today we have Spenser Liszt on from Motif Planning and the Thriving Musician podcast. Spenser, my man, I'm super excited to have you here with us today. And we can dive into this and talk, and you can answer our very dumb questions.
No stupid questions.
Thank you.
Only stupid people.
That's right.
But dude, yeah, thank you so much for being here out in Dallas, Texas. Excited to have you on. So Spenser, you were kind of explaining this a little bit to us when you got on, but for the people who don't know you, maybe give like a overview of what you do, because I know you have the financial planning side, but you also have some pro bono work and the podcast side of things that you do as well.
Sure. So I'm a former professional musician. I have a master's in jazz studies, and I played all the saxophones and woodwinds for national, local acts, touring, recording, you name it, basically did everything under the sun. And then my curiosity led me to teach myself financial literacy. We can talk about that in more depth, but
yeah,
there's a particular moment on tour that sort of woke me up. And so I started learning financial literacy for myself. It changed my life drastically in a short period of time. And so I immediately needed to teach everyone around me in my music community. So that's kind of what started Thriving Musician in 2017. And so then that curiosity led to me wanting to learn this stuff for real. And I became a CFP, so I can explain that story further. But basically now, after all these years, I do three things. The main, I guess, business that I do is flat fee comprehensive financial planning for musicians and music industry professionals and their families. So we'll talk about what that means, but cash flow, insurance, investments, retirement, estate planning, college planning, major life purchases, you name it, everything with a number on it, any kind of future planning. The music industry is sort of focused on making money with your music, treating it like a business. I don't really play in that field as much as I help you decide what to do with that money once you get it and earn it. So I'm a little bit on the fringe of the industry. People aren't really familiar. They don't think of a financial planner as being a main person on their team. They think business manager, tour manager, agent, whatever, entertainment attorney. But really a financial planner is like the MD, the music director, and the CPA, the insurance broker, the estate planning attorney, the entertainment attorney, the business manager. That's like the guitar player and the drummer and the keyboard player.
Yeah.
So that's how I think
I
about
like that
the team.
analogy.
Yeah, that's a killer analogy, man.
That's great. Like the financial planning that I do. So that's Motif Planning. And the other two things, so Thriving Musician, which is what I started way back in 2017, just free education. So financial literacy for DIY musicians. And so for people who can't afford or don't want to pay for what is really a high level service that's very hands-on with me one-on-one, you can learn from me. So that's whether that's my podcast, my blog, my newsletter. I do speaking engagements at universities and conferences. It's, the works. And the third thing I do is pro bono planning. So 1 hour a week, I do a session for free where I can legally give financial advice to a musician facing financial hardship. So maybe they're going through bankruptcy or they're super low income. They have a lot of credit card debt or student loans, you name it. I can help them with that problem in that hour without having to review like all of their financial documents, which it can take a long time to do like a whole plan for someone. So that's high level.
But more of like a 30,000 foot, like overarching kind of view for somebody in an extreme circumstance.
And just tackle that problem and then, help them get through that crisis.
Oh, man, that's awesome. So let's dive into the backstory with you, because that's a super interesting backstory. So you came from the music world into the financial world. So let's start with that transition, because I feel like a lot of times it's the other way around, or it's something that people do at the same time. So let's start with, starting in the music side, what you were doing then, and then how that transition into the financial world happened.
Sure. So, my whole life I was dedicated to being a professional musician, even to the point where I didn't even want to teach. It was like, I only want to perform. It was, and partially, I grew up hearing, which I'm sure listeners and maybe you guys heard words like this, like you need a backup plan. You'll never make any money in music, you name it, right? There's the kind of scarce mindset around, whether it's parents, neighbors, guardians, talking to us this way, but also musicians kind of talk to each other that way, which is something to discuss of the mindset and language we use with each other. But grew up with that, which is typical. And so partially I set out to set them wrong, which is not a great way to choose the things you want to do in life, but it is what it is. And I was able to do that successfully, which is, I would say, rare. Although in Dallas, you can make a great living here. It's kind of insane. So there's a lot of work here, commercially and artistically. So I was doing that for, 15 something years, maybe more. And so just freelancing. And so the moment that changed everything, I forget the year. It's on my website. It's like August of 2015, maybe, I think. I was on a tour of the West Coast with a Brazilian band playing music of Hermeto Pascoal. If you're not familiar with his music, it's pretty cool. But it was mainly for fun. It wasn't really something that paid that much, but it was over the summer, had the time, and it was a great experience. But when you are away from home, not earning that much, you're spending while you're on the road, and you also have bills that continue at home. And I'll preface this with that up until this point, I was a really diligent saver. So I was never like a starving artist, so to speak. I always had savings because I was raised that way. My mother grew up very poor. My father's business, we went bankrupt when I was like 2 or 3. So I always had savings. So I never felt like, really close to a crisis. But then this tour happened and I came home. I actually have the photo of the bank statement. I came home with like $67 to my name. And you can actually see when you zoom in on the statement, like there's like 44 withdrawals and like 1 deposit. The 1 deposit was probably like the little check from the tour or something. So I was spending a lot more than I was earning in that period of time. And that was like the wake up call. I felt scared and like sort of unworthy. It sort of just shifted everything of like everything I've worked for, everything I've done has led me to this moment. That's not okay. And I told myself, I never want to feel this way again. And no other musician should ever feel this way again. So I started reading every book and podcast I could get a hold of that was about mindset and financial literacy, which go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. And I just started changing the language, changing my mindset around what I was doing. And in a short period of time, over about 18 months from that point, I bought my first condo, started saving into a retirement account for the first time, and increased my income like drastically. And, sometimes we feel like changing our financial life might take a long time. but it's actually kind of wild how when you really put your mind to things and change your behavior and your language or the people you're around, whatever it might be, how quickly things can change. So to me, it was like proof. Okay, this is definitely something that I should continue studying and working on. And then I needed to teach other musicians. So that's when I started teaching with the podcast and just sharing all the knowledge. And yeah, so that's a good start to my story.
Yeah. So at one point, did you decide that you were going to, end up becoming a financial planner?
Yeah, so I never actually had this as my goal or something that I wanted to do. It was all stemmed out of just wanting to give back and share what I learned because it changed my life. So a couple things happened that naturally led me to this sort of at the same time. It also changed my relationship with music, which will be kind of interesting for y'all to hear. So I was performing full time, and I mean, I've studied, I guess you could get a PhD in jazz or whatever, but I feel like a master's is plenty. And so I, technically did like more than enough schooling, even though probably networking is the most value you get out of going to school for music, and, did everything that I wanted to do. At a certain point, music just became information. So I use the analogy of comedians that go to comedy shows. They know what the joke is going to be. It's information. It's not a funny joke to them when they hear it. And that happened to me with music. So personally, my relationship with music was deteriorating because of the type of work I was doing and the lifestyle that it was affording me. So it's ironic that I now teach musicians financial literacy who do want to continue doing music full time or not. But for me personally, I actually needed to separate money from music to heal my relationship with music.
Yeah.
So
I had to do the same exact thing.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. That was like
Josh had to leave production and come back to it.
Yeah.
He knew that was what he needed to do.
Yeah. The past year and a half, I literally just shut everything off. I was like, I'm not promoting myself on socials. I'm not playing the game. I'm not doing any of that. I'm only focusing on making art that I like. Yeah. And it sucked. I mean, it hurt my bank account a lot, but it's I had to do that because I was taking jobs just because I knew that I was going to get paid. And that's not how you make good art. That's not how you make a good reputation for yourself. And, I think it's almost frowned upon, whenever people talk about that. But at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is 99% of people who work in music would literally be better off just keeping it as a hobby, And so it's I feel like you have to always be conscious of that and not be afraid to just turn it off for a little bit,
Yeah, my definition of a thriving musician is literally just someone who does music without any contractual, financial, or any sort of obligations. That you can, if that's what you want to do, but if you're just doing the art because you want to, the money part, it doesn't have to be involved. So a thriving musician can be a hobbyist or someone who does it full time. It's up to you and your relationship with music.
Exactly.
I something me and Josh have talked about a couple times is that balance of I think people see it as a black and white thing of you're either doing it for yourself as a hobbyist or you're going full balls to the wall. It's the only thing you're going to do. And I feel the world is like this. Everything is like this. The reality is a lot more gray. Most people that I know don't only just do music production or only just do mixing. There's a lot of guys that do, and that's great. But normally they are having their hands in either multiple aspects of the industry, or they have one hand in the music industry and they have another hand in some other industry, or have some sort of other thing. Now, whether music is the side thing or this other industry is the side thing can be whatever. But I think that balance is, like what you said, it's probably a lot more healthy because then you don't get the extremes of, well, I gotta get out of this because it's harming my relationship with something that I actually do love.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we all have our own unique values, and we have to understand what those are and think about them. For me, and just the other things we might enjoy about our life. And so for me, I like making things. So I actually do woodworking, and none of that would have happened if I hadn't stopped, because when I was doing music, that was the focus. I mean, I sort of gave up a lot of other interests in school
Yeah.
for music and all that good stuff. And so it's kind of wild to see the other aspects of life that now have the space to formulate when I gave it that space. And
Yeah.
you're right. There is a lot of pressure from the community. There's a pressure from the people around you, your friends and family, social media, whatever it is. And the issue, in my opinion, there is that music is sort of an identity based career or endeavor, and just naturally. And so if we don't separate those things, there's me, my identity as a human, and then there's like the identity of me like as an artist. If we don't think about that and address it and face it, then we might succumb to the downsides of feeling that pressure to continue doing music because that's who I am. That's all I am.
100%.
I love this,
So-
dude. This is
Yeah,
great.
dude.
I've
Yeah.
talked about that multiple times about there's a mix engineer I like named John Castelli, and he was talking about that, about how like specifically with music, art, anything like that, you end up completely wrapping your identity around whatever it is that you're selling, you know, your services. If you have a clothing brand, your clothes, like whatever, you know. And so he's like, this was like probably 2 years ago, I was listening to him talk about this, and he was saying the easiest way that he was able to describe it is like, I am not this guy who is a mix engineer. I am a guy who likes a lot of things and just so happens to be a mix engineer. And that was like the start to me being able to kind of like take a step back and like focus on the art and not be so worried about the money, because it's like at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where, you know, your bills get paid from.
Exactly.
Because all of the most successful people that I know do not think about money. You know, if they're working with an artist and the budget isn't there, if it completely doesn't make sense, they'll say no, but they still take on free projects all the time because they love the process. They love the art.
Mhm.
And it's kind of funny how that works. You know, the most successful people don't think about money, which is a luxury, right? You know, because they're busy enough, they don't have to worry about it so much. But I feel like there's, you know, too many people at the lower and mid levels are so hell-bent on like achieving this rate or getting this fee or hitting this amount of money per month that the art ultimately suffers, and that's going to prevent you from leveling up again and again.
Yeah, you're touching on a mindset that I talk about often. And the phrase I use is money is a consequence, not the goal. And if your mindset is, I just want to make music and to make money, even if you achieve that goal of getting the money, you're likely not going to feel anything. There's no fulfillment there because money is a tool.
I heard somebody say this, and to a similar end, which was, if I wanted to make money, I would not do music. There are a million other industries where you can make $1 million more than you could ever make in the music industry way faster. Like you do it because you love it, not because you're in it for the paycheck. Yeah. Obviously, like you said, it's a consequence. It's not a reason.
Yeah, and I see it all the time where people find success, whatever that means to them.
Sure.
And their goal wasn't to become rich and famous, but sometimes that happens as a consequence. Whether they wanted that or not is something to ask them. But you can kind of tell when they do interviews, and you can just tell by the way they're talking that was not the goal. And once you see money as a tool, then it's something you should use properly. That's right for you along the way, because once you get it, you're just going to go, well, now what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's amazing. So how long ago was the transition that you said from music to finance, that whole like transition you just talked about? I think you
Sure.
said it was 2017ish or 2019 maybe.
Yeah, so like in 2017, I started Thriving Musician, started educating people. And so basically, it was all self taught at that point. So for about
Hmm.
a year or so, I was just kind of doing it on my own, just from what I learned and how I implemented it into my life. And at a certain point, I wanted to learn from experts, or I wanted to meet
Yeah.
other people who were experienced in this world. So I was looking up conferences to attend, and one of them said you had to be a CFP to go, and I didn't know what that was. So I looked it up, and it's Certified Financial Planner. And I noticed you could take these courses at universities to get this certification, and all the course titles were the same titles as the course that I had made to teach people. So I just signed up immediately.
Yeah.
So just the curiosity just led me to, okay, well, then I'll just take these classes, because then I'll learn this stuff for real. And so this is how the curiosity led me to this. Basically, I started taking the courses. I paid for them myself. It's a 2-year program, but you can do it in one. So I was doing Monday, Wednesday night classes, still gigging full time. And during those courses, like kind of the next, if you want to become a CFP, you take an exam that's incredibly difficult at the end, and then you have to get experience hours doing planning. And so I was thinking to myself, well, I paid all this money, I'm doing all these classes, I may as well take the test. It's like, okay, I'll take the test. And then it was like, well, if you're going to take the test, like, you may as well get the experience hours and become a CFP. It was like, that wasn't my goal when I signed up for the classes, but it was like, well, I may as well. So I did go and find a job here. And I worked there for about 4.5 years. And so it was a 2-year experience requirement. So once that 2 years came, I can officially use the CFP marks. I'm officially a CFP. But I've been doing planning for about 5 years now. So then after the 4.5 years, I actually stopped Thriving Musician. So the timing of all this is kind of crazy. So I started working that job in early 2019.
Mm-hmm.
I got married like a couple weeks before taking the exam. So anyone out there who's like becoming a financial planner, like, don't do that. That's way too much to do in your life.
Yeah.
It just happened to like line up like that.
That's
because
crazy.
I wasn't planning on taking the test, right? Like we already had the wedding planned and stuff. And anyways, that was wild. So then, early 2020, February of 2020, I had this job and I was kind of making this transition, and I was like, right around that time, like I said before, I realized I needed to separate money and music to heal my relationship with music. So that was around this time. So in February of 2020, I told everyone, hey, like, I'm done. And some of the companies that I worked with had gigs booked like almost throughout the whole year. So what happened is, I don't know who this person is. I tell this story all the time. So I told them that I'm done. Someone got like a year's worth of gigs that were mine that I gave up in February of 2020. And then COVID hit in March 2020, and everyone went unemployed. So someone got a bunch of gigs and then had them all taken away a month later. I don't know who that is, but I feel for them. And but everyone, in the music industry suffered, right? And so around this time, I just decided that I personally just felt uncomfortable talking about like building an emergency fund to people who are the emergencies already happened. And so I just decided to stop the Thriving Musician, the financial literacy education, and just focus on being a good planner and learning and getting that experience. So I did take a pause from the education for a little while, but now in August of 2023, I left that job and started Motif Planning. And then subsequently, I started all the education stuff back up too. So we're going full speed.
Congratulations, man!
Again.
That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
That's awesome, man.
I like it. You just couldn't hold off from the freelance life, huh?
It was calling you, dude.
Yes.
Yeah,
Exactly.
That's
so it's
great.
interesting because I'm re-entering the music industry from a completely different standpoint, and like the value that I bring is unique.
Yeah.
And
No,
I'm
that's
not
super
just
cool.
like the sax player.
There's like this reoccurring theme where there's so much bad advice out there, and there's so many people that look at music as as an untapped market for whatever bullshit they have to sell, right?
All the tech companies also that are infiltrating the industry.
The tech companies that are just giving us awful products, besides Samply, shout out to Samply. And all of the producer life coaches, business coaches, all that stuff that just give awful regurgitated sales advice that you can get if you worked at a used car lot for a month.
Which Josh did.
Which I did, and I was able to confirm this, that all that money I paid was for nothing. And so it's really cool, having somebody like you where it's not like, oh yeah, like I always wanted to do this thing, and then because of so and so I ended up working in music. It's like I worked in music, I ate shit, and then because of that I wanted to fix it, and now somehow I ended up here helping other people so they don't have to eat shit too. And like that is like really like inspiring, but also really comforting, that there are people like you out there, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this are, will agree with me on that. And I lost my train of thought 100%.
No, I mean, that's a fair, go ahead.
Let me add to that, because I think this is something that we should discuss, because so what I do is quite rare in the industry because it's not normalized, which I'm hoping to normalize, is talking about money, but also talking about personal finance. We typically only talk about like business. And so one thing I want to really highlight is when you're talking about all this advice out there that's really bad. It is astounding, and it's really hard for me to see it because people just take the advice. People will play on your emotions and say things, this is going to blow up your business, or there's all this investment stuff out there, and none of it's personalized, and it's because it's to a broad audience, and none of that advice could be true for you unless someone actually knew you and knew everything about you. So some terms to know that I think would be really important is one in particular is fiduciary. So what that means is it's like the Hippocratic Oath for doctors, but for financial planners. So doctors say, I'm always going to try to save your life, right? And keep you healthy whenever I'm helping you at all times. Fiduciary just means, as a financial planner, that any advice that I give is always in your best interest, 24/7, no matter what. The alternative to that is called suitability. And that means that as long as what I recommend to you is suitable enough in the court of law, I will be safe. So if I make a kickback or a commission, it's all good. As long as what it is suitable enough, I'm allowed to make money off of that. And, you can decide if you're cool with that or not. I'm not. And I don't sell products or make commissions or make kickbacks or have arrangements with people. So there are other terms too, like flat fee or fee only versus fee based. So there's like terms that you should know when you're talking about this, because the world that I'm in now has a very bad reputation. I mean, everyone has heard of like the Ponzi schemes and those types of people who Bernie Madoff, right? Like that just rip people off that were giving advice. And so unfortunately, I went from an industry that I believe is not legitimate yet, music industry, it's a every person for themselves jungle, and to a financial industry that is legitimate. It has salary transparency. It has, organizations, and it's you can go get jobs with benefits, and there's like structure to like your career and what you could make. And yet it has a bad reputation. So it's interesting. I've kind of experienced like the oddities of these industries. Now, maybe that's every industry in the world, but it's been kind of an interesting transition.
No, I would love to hear on kind of, because we're in that zone. I would love to hear from your perspective, what is some of the worst advice you've ever heard?
And then we'll get to the best advice.
And then we'll get to the best advice.
Yeah,
but maybe that could help qualify with some people as well,
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of typical advice where people are selling products, and you'll hear things like infinite banking, whole life insurance, annuities, a lot of people will sell these insurance products that are very expensive, and they might work for someone who is extremely wealthy and doesn't have anywhere else to put their money. There are certain situations where that might make sense, but for most people, it's not. So I've even had. It's funny. I actually had my insurance person. He found out that I became a CFP, and he said he kind of tried to push one of those products on me, and I had just learned about them. And it was like, no way, dude. And he tried to like sell it, but then he was like, oh, well, I'm a CFP too. And I said, oh, cool. And he said, but I can't, my company won't let me use the marks. Well, that means he's not a fiduciary. He's not allowed to actually act as someone who works in your best interest. So he can't use this designation that he has, which is a red flag, right? And so there are a lot of products like that. There's a lot of like, anytime you hear something that sounds like a get rich quick scheme, or just something that sounds too good to be true, it's likely the case, because with money, there are ways to get rich quick. But in my experience, that's from you doing something of value in the world, not from taking advantage of like a loophole in the system. Usually wealth is accumulated over a long period of time. So if you're familiar with compound interest, it's a curve that happens as if you keep contributing to your savings and it grows over time. It looks like a flat line for a long time, like years. But then in year 10, year 15, 20, 30, that line starts to shift upward, but you have to wait a long time.
Yeah.
And then in those later years, your money's compounding like crazy. And that's really the way to build wealth. It's like slow and steady. Just keep doing what you love and keep setting money aside and just live a normal life. And so I don't have like specific advice, because I actually don't really consume hardly any content. And if I ever see stuff like that, I block it or restrict it or whatever.
Yeah,
so
no,
there's plenty. I guess the only other one I would say is it's not like bad advice. It's just not personalized. There are a lot of talking heads or gurus who are well-known names, household names, and they have radio shows or they're on, TV shows. And they actually do give some good sort of basic advice for people, but that advice might not be what you should be doing, because you in particular have student loans, or you in particular make all this income. So you're in a different tax bracket. Like every single person is unique, and every financial plan I make is just as unique because of that. And so blanket advice that's given out to the public in most cases is not going to be in your best interest. So some of it is useful. So just think about your situation, and does what they're saying apply to you?
Yeah,
100%.
For sure. So I kind of have a question for you as far as, all right, so in my state, I didn't have to register as a sole proprietor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for a while, I was just getting by, just using my normal checking account, filing my taxes as a sole proprietor. What would you consider like the bare minimum, like the starter pack? Like, is someone who is a full-time freelance producer, musician, what are the things that they should do?
Yeah.
Like day one.
Absolutely. So you'll hear this a lot across the industry, and I don't like this quote, but I guess I should start with it. Is like, treat your music like a business. I kind of tired of hearing it, but for someone who may have not heard that before, that's definitely step number one, is to realize that. I don't really want to get into that, because I think you can find people talking about that infinitely across the world. And so that's something to think about in terms of changing your mindset there. So let's assume that you are treating your music like a business and it's your full-time income. So the first thing I would probably do is set up in most cases, I would probably set up an LLC. And so I'll explain what that is, and I'll explain what other options are. People ask me all the time, what's the difference between an LLC and an S Corp? And so they're very different.
They're super different.
Yeah.
I had this explained to me by my accountant. And he was like, he went through this whole thing, and I was like, all right, so that's very, very different. So, but I'll let you explain it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So people think that there's like some tax benefit to doing an LLC, and there is none. And so an LLC is the same thing as a sole proprietor. So that means that your income flows through from your business to you. So you pay the taxes just like if it was you personally making that income. So there's really no difference there. What an LLC does is an LLC means limited liability company. I actually think the C is something else, but I just say company. And so it limits your liability. So if something happens, let's say you're producing a track and I don't know, I'm just trying to think of an example. You release it too soon, or you release it and there's this huge error on it, and there's like a bunch of like really toxic stuff on it. I don't know, I'm trying to think of something that would piss someone off. And that gets released, and the person says, hey, like you produced this thing for me, but guess what? You like put this weird sample in that's incredibly inappropriate, and now I've lost a bunch of income because everyone hates me because my track is like super toxic or something, right? It's a totally weird hypothetical. And then they sue you, right? So they're suing you for damages, right? And so what happens is they would only be able to come after your business assets that are in the LLC. So the LLC limits your liability only to what's owned by your business. They can't go after your house or your car or your personal checking, right? So it's a way to protect yourself from complete financial ruin. And so the next step is to have, a business checking and a business savings and maybe a business credit card. Now, it depends on your experience with credit cards. I recommend paying them off every month. Only spend what you have in your checking on those cards and pay them off. Maybe you get some points from those credit cards. That's great. But a business checking and a savings, it's really easy to do. Pick a bank either that you're already with or a reputable one. The only thing I would say is they will, in my experience, like they had me come in, and talk to their kind of business person in the bank. And, banks sell products basically. And so they told me about all this other stuff like payroll that they have, all these other things. And you just say no. Or unless you want that, you can do what you want with that. But you're going to get, anytime you're working with banks or, almost anyone, they're going to have other things that you can purchase from them. So just navigating that, but it's fairly simple and easy to open those. And then everything runs through the business. And I forgot to say this, but with the LLC, you don't have to do this, but I don't really recommend using your personal name as the LLC. Make it something else that removes the business from your personal identity. Like if I had Spenser Liszt LLC, it's kind of like, is that really separate from me personally? Like if I were to do other things outside the business that were similar, or you can kind of muddy the waters. It's not like a hard and fast rule, but something to think about.
You can always use a DBA to
exactly
do it, which is what. So I have Collective Studios as my like entity, but I DBA as me.
That's totally fine.
Under my LLC. So it's just easier in case I need to have branch offs or set up a secondary. Like if I want to start in a secondary business, I can have it under that umbrella and it still not be connected to me. And it kind of keeps everything all nice and clean and separated, just in case, legal proceedings.
Can you explain to me what a DBA is?
Do business as.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So my company is Thriving Musician LLC, but then Motif Planning. When I'm operating under Motif Planning, it's Thriving Musician LLC, doing business as Motif Planning. And I give investment advice in that Motif Planning as part of comprehensive financial planning. That does not happen outside of Motif Planning. So when I do like the education or the pro bono is different. That is under Motif Planning. But any of like Thriving Musician stuff that's not in that second layer of Motif Planning, I'm not doing any sort of advice, right?
Yeah.
But any advice is always under Motif Planning.
So Josh, a good for instance for like my situation is I have Collective Studios. I have under that DBA as Drew, the producer. But then like if we wanted to do something for the podcast, I could set up a secondary under as Home Studio Hangout under Collective Studios, but it would not interfere with me, the producer financials. And because it's a producer name, it also kind of separates me, Andrew Simmons, from that as well. So I've kind of like thought through a lot of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
So that's like generally what an LLC is. One thing you should definitely consider is it's the rules state by state. So in Texas, it's a one-time $300 fee. That's it. Now, every year you have to file a franchise tax form. And in Texas, as long as you make less than $1 million, that's waived. If you make more, there's a franchise tax. Very simple. But in California, it's $800 a year.
It's crazy.
There's no avoiding it, right? So you have to go to the Secretary of State for your state. Whether it's straightforward or not depends on the state. Most like government websites are hard to navigate, but it's a relatively simple process. But that'll give you an EIN, so you can use that as your tax number.
Yeah.
But if you're just a sole proprietor still, LLC, like a single member LLC, you can still use your Social Security on your tax return. Those are the same thing because it's still just you. It's all flowing through to you, right? So there's no tax difference if it's a single member LLC. If it's multiple members and it's a partnership, that's different. So with the S Corp, that does have some tax consequences that may or may not be a good idea. So once you start generating a certain amount of income, let's see, how do I explain this like quickly? So let's say your LLC, you're self-employed, right? So that means you pay self-employment taxes, which is, so there's Social Security and Medicare. Those combined is 7.65% of your income. 6.2% is Social Security and 1.45 is for Medicare. That is for the employee side. So then there's also the employer side. That's another 7.65 for Social Security and Medicare. So there's employee and employer. That comes out to 15.3% total. When you are a W-2 employee at a company, or maybe you work for a company with music and they pay you W-2, the employer will pay 7.65%, and you pay your portion 7.65%. When you're self-employed and you're making 1099 income and just claiming the income that you make as a self-employed person, you are the employee and the employer. So you pay both sides. So we're paying a lot more self-employment tax, right? So what the S Corp does is when you're making it up above a certain amount, you can file an S Corp, which basically you pay yourself a regular salary for the role that you do. And so you can determine what that is. Maybe it's $80K, like a producer. That would be what people would consider an average pay for a producer in the United States. I'm just making up that number. Sure. So you would pay yourself that amount. That $80,000 would be subject to self-employment. So you're still paying 15.3% on that. But any income you make above that $80,000 is not subject to self-employment. And you are basically just paying yourself a distribution from your business. So you're still paying you're paying half of that 15.3%, but you're saving like that 7.65% of self-employment tax. So it can be beneficial, but there's also costs. So you have to have a payroll system set up. Typically, you would pay your accountant a yearly fee to do that. So there's like a lot more administrative stuff that goes along with it. So you'd have to like figure out, is it worth paying? Like you're paying to save on taxes. There's sort of a break even where it makes sense.
I've also heard that, at least this is how it was explained to me, is that really an S Corp is better if you have a bunch of employees.
Yeah.
Like basically that's whenever you start hiring employees, like if you ran a studio and like if you owned a studio, ran a studio, had a bunch of engineers in your payroll and maybe some other people in your payroll, then you would want to have it as an S Corp. But I believe that's when they're on your payroll. Now, if you're just paying for them as subcontractors and they're not on your payroll, you can continue acting as a sole proprietor LLC.
You just deduct the income they make from your business revenue.
Exactly.
That makes sense. So with an S Corp, you set like what your salary is. are you able to access any of the excess, or does it
Yeah.
have to? Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
you're just
I wasn't
basically
sure if it just has to stay with the business, you know?
No, you're basically paying yourself from the business as a distribution. It's not income. So think about you're separating yourself. The S corp is separating the business as the employer and you as the employee. So the employer is paying the employee, you are paying yourself 80K.
Yeah.
And then the business is paying out extra above that in distributions to the owner of the business, which is you.
Which is also
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just a very
business
complicated
distributions
way
are
of
not
paying
self-employment
yourself.
tax.
Yeah.
So this is getting into like more CPA expertise.
Yeah.
So like these are things that I think about and talk about. But at a certain, like for me, what I do is I do lifetime tax planning, whereas a CPA will file your taxes properly this year. They may look at last year's. They're not thinking about like over the next 60 years, like how much tax are you going to pay in your lifetime? That's what I do, is try to minimize your lifetime tax that you pay.
Yes.
I like that.
Yeah. So and that's probably the clearest way I've heard both of those things explained.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad.
That's great.
Yeah, because like whenever I was doing my digging on this originally years ago, whenever I was setting all of this stuff up, it was not explained very well, because a lot of times it was financial or CPAs or, people in different financial aspects explaining, who had no relevancy to what it is that a music producer, like how it funcks like as a business. Whereas I feel like you understand like the talking points and how to explain it a lot more concisely.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah. So continuing down this path, like Josh said, we have this ideal person. Let's say, it's a music producer who's starting to take it really seriously. This is what they want to do. So we want to get our tax stuff set up. We want to have the bank accounts set up. I have mine set up at a local bank just because fees are less, and so I don't mind dealing with the lack of technological advancements, because sometimes that's kind of how it works. That's what you're giving up, basically. So outside of the tax side and then the banking side, what are some other things that looking forward into the future when somebody's like just getting started with this?
Yeah, so this will tie into your personal life as well. So you kind of have to manage that and understand what are your living expenses, what are your goals as a family, or do you have interests outside of, like, what do you need money for, like in the next 5 years? Do you want to travel, whatever it might be? One thing I would say, the very first thing personally is an emergency fund is sort of like the number one thing to work on first financially. And you can do one for your business, you can do one for yourself personally. It almost doesn't matter. Like building one, knowing how much you want in there, where to put it, is really important. And then also you have to start tracking all your income and expenses. So whether you do that manually in a spreadsheet, you could download all your statements. So that's what's nice about separating your business checking and savings and maybe a credit card, is you get to the point where everything is flowing through there. And so it's all there. You don't have to sift through your personal accounts and decide what was a business expense or not. And like make sure to change all, like maybe you have a subscription to Spotify or I don't know, whatever. That's like for your business, like switch that to those accounts, and then you won't have to track it. A lot of people use QuickBooks. Some people do it themselves. Or you can use, there's a bunch of softwares out there that you link your accounts. One that's really good, I haven't used it personally, but a lot of planners are hyping it up, is Monarch Money. And it's just a really beautiful interface to link all of your stuff. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but I have seen it recently and it looks nice. My clients, I have a software, the financial planning software has that built in, so they just use that. But there's a lot of different ways to track it, but however works for you, track it. Even your accountant can do that if you want to pay them to do it. So just deciding the best way you want to navigate that. Yeah.
I use QuickBooks Self-Employed
Okay,
personally,
nice.
which is really nice, mainly because it has the travel tracking feature in it, like built into it. So whenever I'm driving to a session, I could track my mileage to and from the session,
Nice.
which is really nice. And then it also allows me to, it's one of the few that I found that allows you to connect your PayPal to it. So any PayPal transactions can also get tracked,
Yes.
which you don't realize how big that is until you don't have it and you realize how many transactions are going through your PayPal. Because
Yeah.
like I invoice through PayPal. I get, so I get a lot of my income statements through that. I kind of use that as a secondary, holding for some money just in case I have like to pay anything out or quick,
Mm-hmm.
since it, is easy to swap money through that than it is through my personal business banking account.
One
So
thing I'll add to that is I don't know if you're crossing state lines or not, but if you are, then you want to track all of those expenses and income in those states because you might need to file a state tax return in those places. And if you do, you want to have your expenses that you spent in those states there to deduct against that income in that state, depending, certain
yeah,
states have
I'm
higher
not
state income
spending,
tax.
I'm not spending the, I think it would probably have to be a decent exorbitant amount of money for that to probably come into play. And so most of
Mm-hmm.
the things that I'm spending when I'm crossing state lines are food, gas,
Yeah.
things like that. So it's not crazy, but if I had to cross state lines to buy like a $5,000 set of speakers or something like that, uh, would get a little bit trickier because then
Mm-hmm.
taxes are different and it gets really complicated. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, but yes, no, yeah, my experiences with, you said QuickBooks, but specifically QuickBooks Self-Employed, which has been nice for me.
That's great.
I did it, and it's pretty cheap. I think it's on a subscription, but it's like $15 a month, so it's like pretty inexpensive. And there's
Mm.
enough codes out there for discounts for the first couple months that I think it ends up being like $7 a month for the first like 3 months or something like that. So, but the Monarch Money one actually does look really nice. I am a big fan of how like clean that interface looks.
Yeah, we want to keep things simple. That's really important as well. The other thing I would say is with like if we're talking about business and we really want to separate our personal and our business. So there are people who run their business and they never pay themselves. Like we really want to get to a place where we're paying ourselves
Mm-hmm.
and not deducting all of our income. We can talk about that more later, but that can actually be quite harmful to do that just to avoid paying tax. Paying more
Yeah.
tax is a good thing. That means you're making more money. So that's a mindset shift to consider.
Yep.
But like with your saving for the future, if you're not paying yourself, then if all of your assets are in your business, then the only exit strategy is to sell your business. Is someone going to buy your producer business? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's something that people do where you have clients who are willing
Yeah,
to
the
work with
closest
someone
thing
who
would maybe
bought
be
your,
buying a
yeah.
catalog. Would probably be
Yeah.
the closest thing to that in the music industry.
Right. So that's good to have that as an
Yeah.
asset, but we also need to save for our personal future. And so it's really easy. I get this question a lot, like should I reinvest in the business or, saving for the future? And my answer is usually both because
Mm-hmm.
you can work in your business and you can always make more income and improve it. But there's only so much time and there's only so much you can put into qualified retirement accounts and stuff like that. And so the earlier and more often that you save, like I said before with compound interest, the better off you'll be later in life. So we really have to keep that in mind. Otherwise, all your eggs are in your business. And like you said, if the only way to sell is to sell a catalog, that's a lot of risk that you're taking where we could also be taking some of that income and saving it, diversifying it. And so think about your business as something that can support you throughout life, but what's going to support you when you either don't want to do this anymore or physically can't do it
Yeah.
anymore?
Or you stop getting calls.
Right. And there's so many. Yeah. So we
You
need
know,
to prepare
that's
for that.
something that I feel like a lot of people don't talk about enough, is that, like, as like specifically if you're a music producer and or any form of an engineer, there is a date in time in the future where like you will stop getting phone calls. You know, it might be after you hit retirement age, but for most people it's well before that. So, you know, it's like important to also think about that. And you know, something that freaks a lot of people out, you know,
Yeah.
which is also why they're just still working constantly, you know, because it's like, I'm just happy to have the work while it's here, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's definitely something that isn't talked about enough.
Yeah, I read a great book last year called Profit First, Mike Michalowicz. I don't know if you've read that one. Great book, actually. I thought it was going to be weird and broy, and it may have been a little bit of that also, but it was very insightful just from like his story is really cool because it's literally the thing that like changed him was deciding to pay his family first and essentially using that as a way to realize that he just wasn't flat out wasn't making enough money. Because like you can say I need to reinvest in my business and not pay myself all the time to quote unquote make more money, but it's hard to have that barometer of am I actually making more money unless you are actually paying yourself. Because if you're paying yourself an adequate amount and your business isn't able to function, then you just flat out aren't making enough money in your
Yeah,
business, and you need to rethink your entire structure.
but then it gets even more confusing whenever you're talking about music, right? Is any other business, you're able to look at something, an investment, and there's an ROI attached to it. There are very few things as a producer, as a mix engineer, as a mastering engineer that you can look at and say that has an ROI attached to it. Because chances are you could probably do it on a lot less. It's going to make your life easier. You might do better work, right? But at the end of the day, sure, a $15,000 set of speakers is your work is going to get better. That might save you more time. You might be able to fill your schedule and knock out more mixes, right? But is that really what's going to happen once you make that investment? You know? And so I think that yeah, there is a threshold to like you need to hit like this level of speaker, you know, you need to hit this level of microphone, this level of whatever. But it's impossible to look at those things and say, "Oh yeah, it's going to make me more money." And so that's always kind of like thrown me off when people are like, "Oh, I need to like reinvest that money and go buy a console." It's like no one's going to hire you because of your console. Like straight up. There's probably 5 people in America that would probably hire you because of the console that you have.
And they're not coming to you.
And they aren't coming to you. They're coming to the dude who actually knows how to use it.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly.
And so, yeah, that's something that is just ridiculous to think about, you know, especially like, you know, I'm planning on moving this summer, so I'll be able to be building my own space. And that's not something I'm thinking about constantly, where it's like, I don't have a lot. I know the bare minimum of what I want, which is expensive. But then I also know like it's kind of pointless to kind of go for lower tier stuff that I'm going to replace just as preference, practice, longevity, whatever. And then you look at that final number and you're like, well, this is just ridiculous. This makes no sense because at the end of the day, it's not a business investment. You know, it helps you make better art.
Mm-hmm. And there's always a dopamine hit when we get new gear and stuff like that. But
unfortunately,
for the future, there's no dopamine hit because you won't. That dopamine will hit in 30 years when you see your wealth.
Well,
so the delayed gratification doesn't really, unless you just feel good. Like I actually get a dopamine hit from saving because I know. So that's a retraining of our brains. But it's really easy to. I need these new speakers. You get them. That feels great. That's an investment, right? You've gotten something right away from it, whether it was financial or not. So it's very important to evaluate those decisions.
Right. And it's also one of those things where if you focus on, saving, now you have less stress about bills. Now you're less stressed and you can make better art, and I think that that's something that a lot of people just straight up don't get, and
I also think we should clarify there is a very big difference, and Spencer, you can speak into this, between paying yourself a business owning account and saving.
Mm-hmm.
Those like paying yourself and saving are not like the same thing. Like, yeah, I mean, you could speak into that as well because I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. Paying yourself is so that you can afford whatever lifestyle that you want. And saving is then taking a portion of that and saving it for later for the future. And both of those are important, right? Because if we're not paying ourselves, then what money is paying our expenses? Is it our partner or what's going on, right? Are we getting money from somebody else? And so it is really easy, even when you're paying yourself, to not save, because it's easy to say, well, everything that I'm paying myself I don't have anything left to save. And that's something that I address with people of how their cash flow is working and are there adjustments, whether it's, making more income is the best way to fix your cash flow problems. But if that's not possible, there are certain ways to navigate debt that you have. Are there ways to adjust your living expenses? A lot of people don't know what their living expenses are or what they're spending their money on. So even just having that awareness, people are like, whoa, I didn't realize I was spending that much on things that I actually don't really care about. So, and I'm not talking about $5 Starbucks cups. When you see those posts online, you can ignore those. Not buying coffee is not going to make you wealthy. Especially if that's something that you value. So I talk about this a lot, is aligning your spending with your values, which requires you to know what you're currently spending on and to know what your values are, and just being real about that. So there's a lot of different cash management styles. One of them is profit first, but there are a lot of different methods that work for different people. And in the end, I think it comes down to mindset and having a basic understanding of when you save, what does that mean? And what is that going to look like? And it does require you to have at least some of your focus on the long-term future. You have to think about what is life going to look like when you're 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. My plans go to age 100. I mean, that's my guess of how long we're going to live, and it could be longer. That's a long time. And our life is going to change drastically over that period. Even if it's not fun to think about that, maybe it is fun to think about that. We have to at least spend some time making decisions today based on what we think. That doesn't mean to stay in the future. We want to be present people as humans. Mm-hmm. But if we completely ignore the future, then all we end up doing is sort of running on a treadmill with our music and our art and our business. And then maybe we're doing fine now. And then if that ever stops, like we talked about or whatever, there's nothing there. We're relying on Social Security, which is not meant to support you fully anyway. So there's a lot to unpack there.
No, I mean, that's we could go down many different rabbit holes there. I think maybe let this be kind of where we want to end. We mentioned it a little bit. Obviously, getting the basic bank accounts, basic things. Now let's take one step further than that. So let's say, we can even use me and Josh as a pretty solid example. It's, we're working, we're making a good living, but we want to do what's we have all of the basics set up. We have our LLC, we got our business bank accounts. Maybe our cash flow is working and we have at least enough to save a little bit, or we have, we're paying ourselves well, decent balance of, the financial structure of our business. What is something that like a lot of people that are trying to make that next step don't think about?
Yeah, and this one's not going to be fun. And I would actually put it as the number one thing, but it's just not usually feasible to do right away, is insurance. And the main one being disability insurance. So this is a tricky one. And so I'll explain what it is, how it works, and why it's tricky for musicians and producers. But imagine a situation where you suffer an illness or you go deaf. You can't hear anymore. Something that causes you to no longer generate income from your expertise. What do? You still have living expenses, but no more income. Your income goes to zero. That's not great. If you do have an emergency fund that will last X amount of months or years, however, depending on how much you've saved, but then what? So it's a little scary to think about. And it's also actually fairly likely. The likelihood of sustaining a disability at some point in your career is 1 in 4. And that's kind of insane.
Whoa.
Now, that could be 1 day, 7 days, 6 months, 30 years.
Okay.
The length of time of that disability.
Yeah.
Sure.
Still, so
But
it could be a
still.
short-term disability. It could be a career-long disability, right? And it, like I said, it could be an illness, could be an injury, you name it. And so what disability insurance does is when you suffer a disability, it kicks in and it pays you money. So there are certain reasons to get insurance. The main one is when there are things that could happen in our lives that are high severity and very low chance of happening, low probability. So this is an example of them. Another one would be life insurance, which we can talk about that another time.
Yeah.
But so with disability, it's 1 in 4 is like a high chance, but like a career-ending disability, you could argue is in most cases very low probability. But if it happens, you can't work and make income producing music for 30 years. You no longer have income. So there are a couple things to know about disability insurance. Is if you work for a company, they might have a disability policy that they pay for that will cover 60% of your salary. So let's just use an example that you make 100K, just to make it easy. What happens is let's say you become disabled, your salary goes from 100 to 60,000. So that's already a big drop. And you're disabled, so that's not great. So who knows if there are expenses there, what life has to change because of that. And let's use the example that it's a career-ending disability, like worst case scenario. If the employer pays the premium, which is the cost of the insurance, the benefit you receive is taxable. So that 60,000 drops to maybe 50, maybe 40. It depends on your total family income, what bracket you're in and stuff like that. That's a massive drop from 100 to 50, 40, something like that. It's still nice to have. It's definitely not going from 100 to 0, but it's something. If you are self-employed and a musician specifically, disability insurance is actually quite difficult to get and it's expensive. So it's really not fun to address it, but it is possible. So what happens is the insurance companies, as of this recording, they see the occupation of music differently than they do someone who works at a bank or a doctor. It's like undefined to them, like they don't get it. Same thing with banks and like trying to get a mortgage to buy a home. They don't get that you making music for people and producing music that generates income. They don't really understand that as like a regular occupation and how that works. So they view it as more risky, especially when they think, oh, you're going to be on stage dancing and doing all this crazy stuff. So it's going to be a higher likely that you are going to become disabled, and people will commit fraud and try to say they're disabled when they're not, just to get the disability check. So there's like all this, it's nebulous. And so unfortunately, that's the way it is. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's something to consider and think about as a business expense to protect yourself And there are all different things you can do to lower the cost. Like you can say, how long do you want to wait until the check starts kicking in? So that's called the elimination period or the waiting period. So it could be 90 days. That's 3 months. So if you're disabled for 6 months, the checks won't start kicking in until 3 months in. If you make the waiting period longer, like 6 months or a year, then the checks kick in later, which lowers the cost of the insurance, because that means you'd have to sustain a disability that was, more long lasting, which is less likely, right?
Yeah.
So they lower the cost, and that's where your emergency fund kicks in. Like you need the emergency fund to get you to that point until the checks start coming. And there's a lot of other stuff to consider. So sure. It's a big topic. It's not fun to think about, but it's like something that you should consider as just a regular business expense that you just have to factor in and go make more money to pay for that. Because if you become one of those people and you don't have it, it is not fun, because Social Security disability is minimal and incredibly difficult to like even get them to pay it. And it's not fun. So one strategy I do talk about sometimes, if it makes sense, is for people who do have a regular job and they want to go full-time into producing. While you're full-time, you can go get an independent disability policy, because they will base it on your job and occupation at your job, which will be really easy to get. And it is portable, meaning you can keep it when you leave the job and take it with you. Now you're a producer, you have that policy that you got earlier, and then you can increase the benefit every 3 years or something like that. So there's a lot of
doing that. I'm doing that. Let's go.
Incredible advice.
That's great advice. No, for real, because that's something that me and Madeline have been talking about, because last year our friend, who's a really, really great tattoo artist, got into a car accident and broke her arm.
Dang.
She was very scared because there was like a chance of like permanent nerve damage. And so like she was basically just waiting, and she was like, thankfully, like I have a really good insurance policy out on my hands, and I was like, on your hands? Like I never even heard of that before, and then that's
basketball players have it a lot on their legs and their hands.
Oh dude, everybody. I found out everybody does. It's crazy. And
that's just an expense that you should consider as normal, just like whatever software you have or your office space. It's the same thing.
Yeah. Dude, and so like that's higher on our list right now than life insurance, because, my fiance, she's a graphic designer. So she's horrified. She's like, what happens if something happens to my eyes? Like I won't be able to work. And, so that's really good to know. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that's something that'll help us out almost immediately. So
yeah, there's a lot of details that we can get into another time, but it's maybe just really quick, high level, like some of the things to be thinking about. So there's this thing called basically like the definition of occupation. And the best one is own occupation, which means as long as you are unable to do your specific occupation, the checks keep going, keep paying to you. There are other ones. So there's any occupation, which means if you can no longer produce music, but you can go work at McDonald's, we're not paying the check, because you can go get a job somewhere else, right? Because the idea is people don't want to incentivize people to never work again unless they can't, right? So it costs a little bit more for that own occupation rider, but it's worth it.
It's super
in
worth
most
it.
cases. And if you work at a job that has employer disability, a lot of times those policies are own occupation for 2 years, and then they switch to any. And so then if your disability is not specifically hindering what your occupation is, then the checks stop. Wow. There's a lot of details around that. And I'm not an insurance salesperson or anything, but it's one of those things that that's like my number one thing that I do when I work with clients is tackle that one. And there's a lot of little things to think about. But
is that also by state as well? Is that a state specific thing, or is it generally like, are there state guidelines for that, for anybody that's listening, that they might need to check with their state representative, or like?
No, there shouldn't be. The only thing would be probably stuff you won't see is that where you live might change the actuarial studies that insurance companies do. Like if you live in the mountains, maybe you have more of a chance of, I don't know, like falling off a cliff or something, like
Jaguar fights or something.
Like stuff like that. I don't know.
No, okay, that makes sense. I wanted to make sure that it wasn't state specific to, like, different states have different policies on other things. You know what I mean? I know when you're talking finances and in general and on health and things like that, sometimes it can be state specific, sometimes it can't be, sometimes it's not. So I wanted to clarify. But I know, especially like what Josh said, that is going to be huge, because I know a lot of our listeners are either bivocational in the sense that they are a full-time music producer and a full-time something else with a more normal job. And they're fine like that, but they might want to make sure that they have that, independent insured on the other side. But then on top of that, or people that are in that place with the goal to go full-time into the music side, like, and if they're thinking 5 years down the road, like they have a 5-year plan for that, that's something that they can start looking into now to make sure that whenever they do make that transition, they're covered, like they're good.
It also allows only them go up as you age.
Yeah. Well, I was also going to say it also allows for the financial side to be already at play, so that you've not made the transition and now you need to make more money than what you were planning on making.
Exactly.
Because that's a huge aspect of it too, as far as making the jump, which I had to learn the last couple years when I made the jump. But yeah, you figure it out. Well, Spenser, thank you so much for coming and hanging out, man. This has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Thank you for answering our questions. If people want to find more about you, check you out, hit you up, or anything like that, where would you like us to send them?
A couple different places. So it just depends on what you're looking for. If you want to plan and do the full boat, and you want guidance and you want help, motifplanning.com. And all my fees are on there. I have sample financial plan you can look at. There's kind of it's like Melody Woodstock. So there's a lot of like Woodstock festival references in there. And I have everything is very transparent of what it looks like, what it costs, what you get, all that good stuff. And that is ongoing planning. So I don't do hourly or project-based. There are other planners who do. So feel free to reach out and I can redirect you to someone that's a good fit. Because that's really all I care about, is finding someone that's a good fit for you and what you're looking for. But if you just want to learn, you can go to moneymaestroblog.com, or you can look up the podcast, Thriving Musician Podcast, wherever you listen. Feel free to email spenser@motifplanning.com. That's SPENSER. And yeah, I really only use LinkedIn and Instagram at the moment. Kind of dropped the other ones for now, but you can find me pretty much anywhere, just Spenser Liszt. And feel free to message me, hit me up. Happy to help however possible. And the pro bono is on the Motif Planning website. So it's pretty clear how to apply for that.
And all of those links will be in the description as well. If people just want to check the podcast description, or if they're watching this on YouTube or anywhere, they can check the description. Direct links will be for all of that. Spenser, thanks so much for coming and hanging out with us today.
Absolutely. It was wonderful.
Incredible conversation. Josh, thanks so much for being here as well. Listener, Thank you so much for listening. And we will see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Home Studio Hangout podcast. If you could take the time to like, subscribe. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other audio platform, go ahead and make sure you're subscribed, and also leave a rating and a review. It helps the show get out to new people, and we're trying to grow every single week. Once again, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Home Studio Hangout podcast, and we'll see you next week.